All right, we'll call this meeting to order, subject to section 19.83 of the Wisconsin statutes. This is the School District of Prescott Board of Education special meeting. First item up is adopt our agenda. Is there any changes? Do you have something to add?
No.
I'll make a motion that we adopt the agenda as presented.
I'll second.
We have a motion and a second. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? That carries. Item C, review minutes of our previous meeting.
I think that was just usually on there. I don't see any minutes attached, so we can skip over
All
that.
right, we'll get rid of that.
Go.
We'll move right to item E, business. Number 1, personnel. Roger?
Yes, personnel, we just have a couple of resignations, as you can see. We have a resignation from Ashley Provo, Malone special education teacher, and Dar Hove, who's been grant writer for us the last 2 years. They've both done an excellent job for us the last 2 years. Super job. It's recommended you accept their resignations.
Any questions?
Nope.
No questions?
Motion?
I'll make a motion that we accept the resignations of Ashley Provo and Darhovel.
I'll second.
We have a motion and a second. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? That carries. Item 2, consider bids to re-roof, repair the bus garage.
Well, as you know, we've talked about this quite a bit, and at the last month or so ago, we asked Mike Hoyka to solicit bids from local contractors to replace the steel panels in the bus garage. If Mike, you could get up there and explain the bids, what you have. I believe they're found on page 4.
All right, we had placed an advertisement to bid the bus garage to replace the steel panels. In our last meeting, we decided we would get a bid for 24 gauge and also an alternate bid for the 22 gauge, which is the heavier of the two. We did have 7 different contractors come out and actually look at the job on site and received 6 bids, 6 different bids, so it was a great turnout. And then also, out of those, 4 of the companies had the same panel, exact same panel, from the same distributor and everything. So that's a good panel. Did a little calling on it, so got some dimensions on there and the weights and some of the would be the tensile strength to KSI yield. So there, you can see that all of the panels that were bid were real close as far as specifications. Only received one of them that had a copy of their warranty in their packet. So, and it's a 25-year warranty. So, I also did call some different builders of steel manufacturing and also some factory reps, and most of them because our building, the building up our purlins that run across the steel rafters are 5 foot on span, and all of them really recommended that we would go with the 22 gauge panel for that type of structure.
Why?
Because it's getting to be quite a distance of a span, so they recommend the stronger panel. So just for the snow load, even if you walk on there, we have 24 gauge up there now, and it does what they call a popcorn effect.
Okay.
So
it's just more sturdy because...
it's just a stronger roof panel.
All right. Any questions?
And Mike, the recommendation from you and I is the 22 gauge panel?
Yes, I would recommend the 22 gauge panel. And our low bidder was Duran Builders for $58,354.
Great. Mike,
Have we ever done business with Duran Builders before? Just out of curiosity. Do we know anything about it?
Not since I've been here. I have did a little bit of work, not directly with them, but for another building I was managing at one time. And the leasee actually hired them to do some of the work, so they're a very reputable company. Some other people I know in the area have used them to build their commercial buildings. Good firm.
Okay. That's all I had.
Did any of these other companies come with the warranty?
You know, when I put out the bid specifications, I had on there, I would like to see their warranties. They were the only ones that had theirs in the packet. You know, separate. They were bidding all the same panels, so I would, you know, I can only, you know, kind of assume, being everybody's bidding the same panel, that they would be the same warranty.
How can we get past assumptions there and just validate that?
Well, I guess we could call them and ask them for it.
But the one that did have the warranty is a little bitter.
True.
But what if the other ones have like a 50-year warranty?
You know, on the specification, we, you know, I mean, I guess we could call and ask if you would like me to do that. They, you know, I did have it on the bid spec to have their warranty in there. You know, that was in the spec sheet, cut sheet.
All right.
You know, that was asked for up front, so.
Dan, any other questions?
What's, remind me, it's been a while, I mean, this has gone on a little while. What's, how does this compare to the initial investment we were looking at making?
We, some of the quotings, I don't have that. We're right around this area. I don't have the exact numbers.
I brought that with
Okay.
Mike. The length of the low bid was Schweikert's for aluminum coating. They had a bid of $34,272 plus $1,500 for a 15-year warranty. So that'd be about $36,000 to 15-year warranty.
Yeah.
That was for aluminum coating.
And I kind of caution on that quoting too, that, you know, you got to make sure the prep of that will, you know, fit into that guidelines. If they can't get it prepped to make that quoting adhere to it, will not receive that warranty. So it's kind of like, you can do it, then the company say, well, they didn't adhere, they didn't prep it properly, so. That's one of the things I caution about recoating, you know, that it will be, probably have to be done. And part of it is because our roof is, I think it's gone past that stage myself, to get a really good product to stick to it for a long term. I mean, it's pretty rusty. So,
All right. Time for action if we decide to do so.
I'm going to make the motion that we accept the low bid from Duran Builders for the 22 gauge steel at $58,354.
Do we have a second? Do we have a second? I'll second that motion. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? That carries. Item F, information and discussion. Receive and discuss the results of the facilities survey.
Dallas, or do we need the thumb drive, or is it going to work? Okay, I guess we won't need it. Thank you.
Should we move?
Thank you.
That's probably a good idea.
I want to introduce, again, for people who don't know him, this is Don Lifto with Springstead. He's one of the people helping with the survey and information, and Don's here to present the information on the survey. So it might be easier for us to sit in the crowd and watch the PowerPoint.
Okay, Roger?
I'm okay. Lift my feet up a little better.
It may work. Otherwise, I can be at your beck and call. You can try it. It's just that I don't know, if we get 40, 50 feet away, sometimes you don't have to put the mouse in.
Anybody need a PowerPoint by
I guess I'm a little bit too far away for the remote, so we'll see if we can coordinate between the two of us. I'm going to have my back to you because I need to be looking at the screen as I'm talking, so I'll try to turn around so that if someone has a question that I can elaborate on, I can do so. First of all, I want to appreciate the opportunity to be back here in Prescott. We last did a study of this type in 2010, and in the report tonight you will see some slides that compare results from 2010 to 2013 based on some similar questions that we asked. This first slide just talks about the purpose of the study, and we wanted to find out what the community thought about the district's need for additional classroom space, their understanding and support for a potential school referendum in the future that would raise money to build a potential new high school, explore community understanding of the potential benefits of a new high school, and then more broadly, as we did in 2010, finding out how people view the district, how they perceive the district, and its programs and services offered. Go ahead. This first slide talks about just some of the basics of what was done in Prescott. Similar to what we did in 2010, the survey included 300 telephone interviews with registered voters living within the school district. Roger and I did talk again today. We actually ended up talking to more than 300, and some of you are aware that we had a programming error at the beginning of the interviews when we started. When we do this type of work, we end up taking addresses from a registered voter file and merging them with databases of phone numbers, in your case from 3 different sources, and there was an error in how that was done. So unfortunately, we did do some interviewing before we discovered that error, and after talking to Roger, we made the correction. And at the district's request, we basically started over and did the 300 interviews from scratch. Fortunately, as was the case in 2010, everything went very well when we got started again. So the interviews were done in mid to late May, and the overall margin of error for the study is plus or minus 5.5%. The best way to think about the margin of error, as you see charts and graphs as we go through this study, if it says that 50% of the people think it's a good idea to do this, or 50% of the people think that the quality of education is an A, just kind of mentally add and subtract that 5.5%, and that's what's called the error of measurement or the confidence band. What that means from a statistical point of view is that there's a 95% chance that the opinions of the 300 are the same as the opinions of everybody after you have added and subtracted that error of measurement. When we do these types of studies, before we actually get on the phones and start calling people, we go through a counting process where we want to understand how many registered voters there are in Prescott, how many are men, how many are women, how many are parents of school-aged children, how many are not, and lots of other demographic factors. And we do that counting at the beginning to make sure that when we do our random calls, we don't end up talking to only people who live in the city of Prescott as compared to people who live outside, or way too many women as compared to men. And we certainly wouldn't want to talk to disproportionately way too many parents and then give the district potentially a false positive on how people would feel about, in this particular case, a new high school. Go ahead. These next few slides I'll go through very briefly, but they just visually show you what I'm talking about when I say we go through a counting process before we start our calls. And the easiest way as you look at these is to understand that the blue bars represent all registered voters living within the school district, and the red bars represent the makeup of who we actually talk to on the phone with those 300 calls. These bars are never going to be the same because you're making multiple calls on a random basis from multiple computers, but the extent to which you see the red and the blue bars relatively similar, it tells you that we successfully controlled for that demographic variable. Go ahead. This is the same information by age. And as you can see, the calls in the red did go to a broad spectrum of registered voters from 18 up through people who are 65 and over. Go ahead. This is the same thing for parent status. You can see, again, the blue bar represents the all parents in this particular case. The red bar indicates who we actually talked to. We actually undersampled a little bit on the parent side, and when we're doing this type of survey, if we're going to err on one side or the other in terms of not matching the demography exactly, we'd rather underrepresent parents somewhat, again, to avoid giving a false positive in terms of reaction to a school proposal. Go ahead. Go ahead. Thank you. This is a representative chart that shows the types of voters that we talk to within the district. In this particular case, a 5 of 5 means a registered voter of any age who participated in the last 5 elections that were conducted within the jurisdiction. So that could be a school board election, it could be a council election, mayor election, presidential election, whatever the last 5 were, these individuals voted in all 5. So they always get there, they're very engaged. And on the opposite end of the spectrum would be the 0 through 5 as we looked at those same elections. And again, as you can see, we talked to a cross sample of people within the community. Go ahead. At the beginning of the survey, when we started talking specifically about the need for additional space, we started with a very general question. This is called the uninformed base. And uninformed in this context does not mean the people that we talked to were uninformed. What it's relating to is the only thing they're hearing initially at the beginning of the survey is this very general statement. So while we're talking about the need for additional space and the potential for a new high school, we don't know any details or context, rationale. So it's an initial reaction to the idea. Go ahead. And this is how it broke out with 55.7% giving a favorable response, about a third in opposition, and about 12% undecided. This is a pretty healthy initial response, again, given the fact that people haven't heard anything about the context, the details, the rationale, or the cost. Go ahead. After that initial response, we went through a series of multiple questions that talked about either factors that were relevant to looking at a new high school in the future, potential benefits of a new high school, rationale, details, and context. And in each case, we asked people, if you knew that this was going to be the case, or this was going to happen, or this benefit was going to accrue to kids in the district, would that make you more or less likely to be supportive? Go ahead. Now, these next 3 slides, or maybe 4, all look the same. And what you're seeing down the left-hand side of the slide are questions that were asked. So looking at question 7 at the top, people were told that the elementary schools are already over capacity. And knowing that, would that make you more or less likely to be supportive of a high school in the future? So the 67.3% on that top bar represents the percentage of people who responded positively to that statement, that piece of information, that detail. And the same is true as you go from top to bottom. The questions you see down the left column are not the actual wordings of the questions. They're abbreviated to get on the slide. And if there are any questions about what those actually said, we can certainly help you with that. Go ahead. This is continuing with the same types of general statements. And again, the percentage of people that are responding positively. You'll remember now, going back to the last slide, all of these, on these first two slides, are at that 52% majority or higher in terms of resonating positively, even though there are differences from the highest one on the previous slide to the lowest one on this particular slide. Go ahead. This next series of questions all talk more specifically about the high school and how a new high school would affect students and the district. And again, you're seeing the percentage of people responding positively to that particular discrete piece of information. Starting with question 17, a new high school would provide the opportunity to move students out of portables, and then going down to question 22 at the bottom, allowing the district to reorganize and serve kindergarten through grade 3 and early childhood programs in one site. Go ahead. These are continuing with the same types of questions related to the high school. And again, you can see them in descending order on a percentage basis, with the lowest one still holding just a little bit over the 50% threshold. Go ahead. Now, after going through that series of questions, we come back in the survey and basically say to the individual, you've heard a little bit more information about this project. Tell me again, what do you think? And that moves us to the next slide, which we call the informed benchmark. And as you can see, support has moved from the 55.7 to the 59. That's within the error of measurement, so that the statistician would say that difference doesn't mean anything, but it's still moving north, and that's certainly what you're hoping for. Now, I can tell you from doing nearly 500 of these studies over the last 20 years, it doesn't always go up. And so we never know until we actually do the survey how people are going to respond to the information, and occasionally it causes support to drop. In this particular case, even though the positive movement is modest from 55 to 59, it does tell us that in total the information was resonating. And as you can see, a little bit of movement from opposition after getting information, and a 1% movement out of undecided. Go ahead. Now, this next slide is beginning a couple slides that will compare some responses in 2010 to 2013. So here what you're seeing is the first uninformed benchmark and the second benchmark from the 2010 survey. So in other words, the first general statement and then how people responded after information. Notice this is called generic because while it talks about the need for more classroom space, it doesn't specifically refer to a new high school as the solution. So if we move to the next slide, you can see how people responded in 2010 to how they responded in this survey. Again, you're seeing two colored bars. The first bar in both graphs on the left is how people responded initially to the general statement before they got information. The second bar on both the 2010 and 2013 is how people responded after they got information. So as you can see, just giving it a quick eyeball, quite similar. Probably the biggest difference is a shift from opposition to undecided. In other words, in 2013, the opposition is less, and the undecided is up a little higher as compared to 2010, which is a positive change. Go ahead. The third benchmark that we always want to test is tax threshold or tax acceptance in terms of what people will potentially be willing to invest in their public schools. And if we go to the next slide, you can see in this particular study, we tested $200, $250, and $300 on a $100,000 home. Now, when we actually did the phone survey with people, these were asked in a random order. So some people heard the 300 first, and then the 2, and then the 250. Others heard the 250, and then the 2 and the 3. And we do it in random order so that there isn't any positional bias, or people get a sense if they're going up the ladder or down the ladder. So in this particular case, as you can see, at the $200 per 100, we're above the 50% threshold at 53.3. When you add the error of measurement, that would be characterized as suggesting a narrow win or a narrow loss based on what we've looked at so far. Go ahead. This is probably the busiest graph, but basically what we're doing here is we're looking at the population of all registered voters, which is the pie graph in the upper right quadrant. And the blue area represents registered voters living in Prescott who pretty much always vote. And in this particular case, always means out of the last 5 elections, they've gotten there for either 4 or 5. So 80% or 100% of the time. The red area represents voters who get there about half of the time, either 2 or 3 out of 5. And the green represents voters that are 0 or 1. So 10% or less. Remembering that if I'm 18 and I voted in November of 2012, I'm going to be a 1 out of 5 automatically because I've only had one chance to vote. So upper right is the profile of Prescott in terms of what percentage pretty much always vote, what percentage vote about half the time, what percentage vote very irregularly. What you see with the line graphs is from the 300 people we actually talked to, how did they respond to the question about taxes? So again, the blue line is how the people we talked to who had the most regular voting patterns over time responded to those 3 tax rates. And the same is true with the other 2. As you can see at the lowest taxation at 200, that red group and the blue group, which represent about 2/3 of the registered voters, were more supportive than the green group. They kind of start clustering in the middle and then kind of all fall away in the same direction at that 300. Go ahead. We also asked a similar question in 2010. It's not quite apples to apples, but it's still of some interest to compare and contrast. You'll see at the bottom of the graph in 2010, the dollar amounts that were chosen at that time to test were 100, 150, and 250. Remember, that was very early in the planning process in 2010 and really didn't know what the preferred solution would end up being. Over on the left in 2013, we asked it to 2, 250, and 3. The only one in common, obviously, is the 250. And if you look just at that one, the tax tolerance improved about 7% roughly from 2010 to 2013. Go ahead. We also reminded people that the district had gone to the voters previously for school referenda in the years listed there, and which of the following best describes how you reacted to these proposals in the past. So we're looking back on this slide rather than looking forward. Go ahead. Go ahead. And this particular pie chart shows you how that question broke out. Almost the same percentage saying that they supported all of them or supported some of them about 60% with those two in combination, a little over 20% indicating opposition to all of them. The other two smaller slices, either people indicated that they couldn't remember or they didn't live here for some or all of those prior referenda. Go ahead. These next few slides will all look very similar to these two, so I'm going to talk a little bit more about this one to make sure you've got your head around it and understand what you're looking at, and we can move through the other ones a little bit more quickly. Here what we're looking at with the blue bars are how people responded to that first general question. Remember, I called that the uninformed benchmark. That first general question before they got context, detail, rationale, or they knew anything about cost. The red bar is how people responded after they got the information. Now, they haven't heard anything about cost yet, but they got all the information about the potential project. So here we're looking male-female, and as you can see with both males and females, support did increase somewhat after people got information. Again, within the area of measurement, not a large difference, but moving north nonetheless. The other thing you're seeing here is about a 10% gender difference between males and females. We always see that gender difference everywhere, no matter what we're testing. And so really all we're looking for is how big is it compared to the norm. 10 to 15% is common, with females being consistently more supportive than males. So you're right in the norm in terms of differences in opinions based on gender. Okay? So this is the same thing by age. Remembering the blue bar is how I responded initially. The red bar, how I responded after I got additional information. Now, even though you see a drop-off from youngest to oldest registered voters in a kind of a linear way, that's pretty much what you almost always see everywhere. Not always, but almost always. If there's good news here, which I would certainly say is good news, is that when the middle-aged and older voters heard more about it, they did respond more positively, particularly with the 65 and up. Go ahead. This is the breakdown by parent status. Everybody knows what parents are. For the purposes of this particular slide, non-parents are people who told the interviewer, I have never had a child in the Prescott Public Schools. The alumni parent in the middle were people who said, I don't have anybody now, but I used to have kids in the Prescott Public Schools. One of the things that pretty much all of our school clients are a little bit surprised about is they expect this graph to look a little bit like the age graph, where the support for the youngest was here, and then we drop down in kind of a linear way for the middle group, and then drop down again for the oldest. They expect this to look the same, but pretty consistently, the alumni parent response is very similar to the non-parent response. That's a study waiting for somebody to do in terms of understanding why. We've done some research in that area, and we think what it has to do with is a lot of the people in that alumni parent category tend to be 50 to 60-ish, maybe. Pre-retirement, I mean, the kids are out of school, but pre-retirement, we're starting to think about am I going to be able to retire? When? How? Maybe we're helping college students tuition. Maybe we've got bounce-back kids who haven't found a job where they can be fully independent yet. So we think there's a lot of pressure financially in that particular group, and we think that that's what you're seeing there. And pretty commonly we see that non-parent as well as that older group kind of bounce back with their support when they kind of get through that stage. Okay? This slide is really interesting. What we're looking at, excuse me, what we're looking at here is, remember we had that question earlier in the study where we told people that there were referenda previously in all these years, and did you support them all, or did you oppose them all, or support some and oppose some? What we're doing here is asking people, of the people who said that they supported all in the past, what percentage said they supported a new high school? So remember back at that pie chart, there was a slice in that pie where people said they supported all of the previous ones. So again, what this is showing you is of the people who said they supported all of the previous ones, 95.6% of them said, I also support the high school. In that mid group, for the people who said they supported some and didn't, there you're seeing about half of them saying they support a high school. And for that slice of the pie on that earlier chart, of the people said that I opposed all of them, only 10%, 10.9 supported the new high school. So I guess, partially what this is saying is that the people who were with you earlier are still with you, and the people who were not probably aren't. But that's a very healthy 95.6 and something that would be a resource and something to build from. Go ahead. Go ahead. This particular graph takes a look at how people responded to the proposal as a function of when did they first go into the courthouse within the district and register to vote for the first time. And so what you're seeing on the right-hand side is for people who first registered to vote here after 2006, the percentage of support is significantly higher than the people who registered to vote somewhere between 92 and 2006 or before 1992. This tends to be very much a proxy for age, where I could move to Prescott tomorrow and register to vote, and that would put me over in that right-hand column. But most of the people in that right-hand column are going to be tending to be, 20 to 35 or 40 rather than my age. So this is a pretty common finding because, again, you get a lot of young people and a lot of young families in that after 2006 category. Go ahead. This is support based on past voting activity. Remember, as I talked before, over on the left-hand side, the very active voters pretty much always vote. The people over on the right rarely vote, and the ones in the middle about half the time. Relatively consistent, with a little more support from that active group. Go ahead. These next few slides look at some of the qualitative things of interest to the district. This particular question is a Phi Delta Kappa Gallup poll question that's been asked nationally for more than 40 years. You're the teacher for the day. Give your local public schools a grade, A, B, C, D, or F. And so you're seeing the percentage for A, B, C, D, and F, and unable to evaluate at the 18%. This is a very positive response, and I'll show this to you in the context of the national poll and also compared to 2010 in the next two slides. Go ahead. Here you're seeing the responses in Prescott as compared to the national poll, and as you see at the top, the PDK stands for Phi Delta Kappa, that's the national poll, and so the second bar in each sequence is Prescott. The two things that are most noteworthy here is significantly more A's and B's than the national poll. And I would remind you, on the national poll, they're answering the same question we asked here. They're not being asked to grade the nation's schools, they're asked to grade their local public schools. So the fact that you're significantly stronger in the A's and B's is very positive. The other biggest difference compared to the national sample is the percentage who had no opinion or were unable to evaluate. One of the things we've seen in the last year or so, year or two, I guess I would say, is the percentage of people saying they had no opinion or couldn't evaluate has been going up consistently pretty much everywhere. And that's probably another study waiting to happen. My own theory about that is that I think now more than ever people are on information overload with smartphones and Facebook and LinkedIn and Twitters and things coming at them both in their work and personal life kind of 24/7, and it's kind of harder to kind of pay attention to what other things are going on or remember to read the district newsletter. But the fact of the matter is we don't know, but all I can tell you is we've seen that consistently in all states, everywhere we've worked, that unable to evaluate has gone up. Go ahead. This slide shows you comparisons to 2010, when we asked this question in Prescott last. As you can see, the A's are almost identical, B's are within 6 percentage points, fewer C's, about the same, D's, virtually no F's, and then the biggest difference, again, is the percentage saying they don't know or have no opinion. So these qualitative numbers are very good. I know from doing this many, many times that board members and superintendents tend to zero in on the AB, which is a natural thing to do. What we do is zero in on the proportion of A's and B's to the D's and F's. And we like to see that proportion, be 10-to-1 or better, A's, B's versus D's, F's. And we don't worry too much about them able to evaluate, because if the proportion of people giving the A's and B's is much, much, much higher than those wanting to give the D or F, if that person who doesn't know or has no opinion runs into somebody at church or the grocery store or shopping or whatever, or a friend or a neighbor, they're much more likely to hear something positive than negative. So good qualitative numbers. Go ahead. We also asked people to rate the state's public schools in general in Wisconsin. You can see that the biggest difference, other than fewer A's, is the unable to evaluate goes up to a pretty high number, over a third of those responding. Go ahead. This again relates to the state schools overall, not specifically to Prescott. And again, as I said, the biggest difference was the unable to evaluate. We had an open-ended question, so with this particular question, rather than picking A, B, C, D in terms of the answer, people were giving their own answer. What do you think is the biggest challenge facing the Prescott School District this year? And as you can see, by almost a 2-to-1 margin, overcrowding, lack of space was the number one issue. Go ahead. We also asked that question in 2010. And as you can see, going top to bottom, overcrowding and lack of space was the number one concern in 2010. It's still the number one concern in 2013, with an increase of almost 4% from 2010 to 2013. Lack of funding was number 2 in 2010, also number 2 in 2013. Other miscellaneous came in 3rd, and you can see building new high school came up for the first time in 2013. Remember, people were offering that answer as compared to picking it, where that was not the case in 2010. On the other miscellaneous, that really doesn't tell you too much in terms of what people said, but the last phase of the work we'll do on this particular project is providing the board and superintendent with a workbook of open-ended responses. And so you're going to be able to look at 300 statements that correspond to this chart. It's not going to change the numbers, but it will give you context and flavor for the meaning behind the bars, put it that way. Go ahead. One of the statements that we almost always use in these types of studies is asking people to react to a statement, and the statement is essentially saying that they would never support a tax increase no matter what the money was used for. And we look to see what percentage of the district's voters are agreeing or strongly agreeing with that as compared to disagreeing or strongly disagreeing. And as you might imagine, the profile with that particular question gives some indication of how steep the mountain is, if indeed the solution selected by the board ultimately is to build a new high school, in terms of the how people are responding to that in the context of tax climate. Go ahead. We also asked that question in 2010, and as you can see, going from top to bottom, the 2013 response is the second bar in each category, so that in 2010, we had 23.4% of respondents agreeing or strongly agreeing with no taxes for any reason. In 2013, that dropped to 19%, so a somewhat more favorable tax climate than was the case in 2010. It's probably, to some extent, beyond local issues, also goes along with the fact that the Consumer Confidence Index, while still well below historical average percentages, is significantly better now than it was in 2010. Go ahead. We also asked people to react to the statement on whether the district can be trusted. And I think on the next slide we see that comparison to 2010 as well. Go ahead. Again, similar to the other slides, the 2013 results is the second bar in each one of those categories. So in terms of trust, in 2010, we had about 65-66% agreeing with that. Very similar in 2013, a substantial increase in the strongly agree, well outside the area of measurement. And again, that percentage of don't know, no opinion is higher. This is again a positive direction in terms of the trust factor, which is very important in any referendum. Go ahead. One last statement that we asked people to react to was whether they disagreed or agreed with the fact that there's a positive relationship between the value of their property or their home and the quality of the district and its programs and buildings. And as you can see in the green section of this particular graph, well over 2/3 of the respondents agreeing with that particular statement, and about 25% disagreeing. You'll note that that 25% is a number that has come up 2 or 3 times, and there tends to be a pattern in terms of, if I'm not willing to invest additional money in the public schools and I'm opposed to additional taxation, I'm probably also going to be in the red, in this particular question as well. Go ahead. Another question that we asked was where people receive most of their information about the Prescott School District. And this is really the most positive outcome that you could ever hope for. It's not unusual. In fact, I was in another school district just last week giving a similar presentation where district newsletter was at the bottom. So we were looking at a chart just like this, except the district newsletter was the very last one on the list. So if you have people relying on what you're sending out, that's a compliment to the district, a compliment to the people doing that work, and a great value to the district in terms of a way to communicate with its residents. And obviously that local paper is also important in terms of getting information out. So this is very positive. Go ahead. It also obviously is not a fluke because this compares the same question to 2010, and as you can see, district newsletter was also widely read at the time. A little less on the newsletter, a little more on the paper, but we're still looking at the same two sources of information being very, very important. Go ahead. In terms of conclusions and recommendations, I won't read all of these to you. I'll just kind of hit the big points and repeat a couple things I've already said. The first big point in relationship to thinking about the feasibility of a high school in the future is that there is a reasonably good base of support for a school referendum that would raise funds needed to build a high school. Now, what supports that statement? Well, first of all, initially when we asked people how they responded to that, we started at about 55%, saying yes, even though they didn't have a lot of background detail, context, rationale, and didn't know what it was going to cost. So we started at a decent level of support. After people got information, that support moved up to 59%. And that's out of the error of measurement. Again, I'm reminding you that when it's within the error of measurement, the statisticians would say it's insignificant, but it still is in a positive direction. Second bullet, although community tax tolerance has increased since a similar survey was done in 2010, support to pay for that new high school did decrease from the 59% down to the 53.3% at that $200 per $100,000 rate. And again, as I talked about that before, given the error of measurement, that could be 58, it could be 48. So it's kind of on the bubble at that $200 level. Based on that finding, in this particular study, we suggested that the board focus on a rate at about $189. Now, where does that come from? Remember those line graphs where you saw what percentage supported at different tax levels? We basically are looking at where does that line cross 50%, and we're just moving you back a little bit for some margin and some cushion relating to the error of measurement. Go ahead. 8 of the statements that we tested resulted in more than 60% saying, knowing that would make me more likely to be supportive. Those were that series, I think, of 7 slides where you saw specific questions about the high school. So 8 of those were at that 60% or higher, and you can see the top 8 and the percentages on the chart. The perception of the district remains very good from a qualitative point of view in terms of people recognizing the quality and benefit of the district. Almost 61% in that A and B range. I think that's the last slide, is it not? Okay. I'll stop there, and I don't know if the board wants to go back and take your seats and then see what questions you might want me to respond to. And if I can't respond tonight, I'll get the answer and get back to Roger tomorrow.
Thank you, Don. Very detailed presentation. Who would like to start with questions? Dan?
Don't start with me, please.
April?
I don't think I have any questions, but I just noticed the power of information, and I think that we need to leverage that more, maybe communicate more, because we're kind of on that line.
Mike?
Yeah, I mean, as usual, Don, this is phenomenal. What a great presentation, a lot of information here that we clearly need to go back and digest some. A couple notes I had scribbled down here. There was a slide about how the tax tolerance improved from 2013, or from 2010 to 2013, but I mean, do you think that was kind of based on, because when we looked at tax tolerance back then, it was for a levy cap, and now we're looking at tax tolerance for a school. Does that play a role into why people would accept, more tolerance, for instance?
Well, I think in the 2010 study, I think we tested for both a facility solution and the revenue cap. Most of the questions were, as you said, were focused on the levy. I can tell you just generally from my experience that while a building proposal can certainly generate more interest/excitement, sometimes polarization, because it's bricks and mortar, it's tangible, as compared to a revenue cap, it's not as tangible. Tax tolerance tends to be pretty consistent. Or another way of saying it, I can't remember a single case where, tax tolerance for a revenue cap was at $100 on $100,000, and it was $300 for a facility program. I mean, if it's $100, it tends to be $100, and it will move a little bit. So I think it's more, it's certainly tied to the high school project because that's all we talked about. But it's not going to be drastically and dramatically different. It's not going to be, I'd be willing to pay $300 for that and only $100 for something else.
And then the other question I had was I looked at the 2010 survey, and there was a question on there regarding facilities, but it was more of a multiple choice question.
Looking at options.
Looking at the different options that people, and when I look back, and I think the support for a new high school in that was 29%, so it jumped from 29 to 59%. Do you think that's because, why do you think that is? I guess I'll ask that question.
Well, not
think?
living here and being here every day, I'll be speculating, but clearly the survey indicated a growing awareness and concern of overcrowding. At the time we did the last survey, you hadn't bought land for a new high school. That causes a level of awareness and conversations to take place. It kind of portends that something is coming. And I know there's been a lot of communication, lots of meetings, lots of conversations between 2010 and 2013. So my sense, it's just a growing, slowly evolving understanding that something needs to be done, and evolving and growing support for the high school as a solution. That's my sense of it. I couldn't point to too much data other than what I went through tonight, but that's my sense of it.
Yeah, that's all. I have your email, so I'll ask you more questions if I have any.
I should have said before we opened for questions that I get about 90% of the questions within the week after I'm here, and so that's just fine.
After we get a chance to dig in.
After you have a chance to think about it, yes.
Dan?
Yeah, I've got a couple questions. If you look at slides 10 and 11,
Page number?
Dallas will show them. Thanks, Dallas.
We just went past 10.
The first, Q7 elementary over capacity. So you stack rank these in order of impact or how much it contributes to support.
Correct.
Is that fair to characterize it that way? So when you say is it fair to state the elementary being over to capacity is sort of the number one driver of all the things we asked of support?
Well, this series of slides, I think there were 3 slides, or either 2 or 3 slides in a row that were more general questions that were factors that were affected by what you do or do not do with a new high school in the future. And then the last 2 we're laser focused on a new high school. And so you don't see references to the high school in slides 10 or I believe in 11 either. So to answer your question, concerns about overcapacity in the elementary is a driving opinion that makes a difference. And the extent to which the solution, if it is a new high school, contributes to fixing that, I would see that as a positive.
Okay, and you seem to look at 60% as a useful marker.
We don't always use 60%. It's more a matter of, is there kind of a natural break where we would differentiate between some versus others? To have 8 statements above 60 certainly is positive.
Okay, if you go to slide 11, please, Dallas. So when I look at Q12 and Q14, as far as what would impact support, that would be statistically significantly less impactful to support than what we saw at the top of the list.
Correct.
Okay.
Relatively speaking.
Yep, it's all relative. All right, so slide 15, please, Dallas. You said on the first slide that the margin of error here is plus or minus 5.5%. And does that apply throughout this?
Yes.
Okay. So when I look at the favor column there, and I noticed that difference, you said that, just to clarify, a statistician would or would not call that significant?
They would characterize that as an insignificant difference. And the reason for that is the 59 could be 64 and a half, or it could be...
Right. Same thing for the opposed column then and the undecided.
Correct.
So would it be fair to interpret that as saying that, if you had to characterize the information provided in the survey as having moved the needle on support in a statistically significant way, would you say that happened here?
From a strictly statistical point of view, no. There's no difference between the 55.7 and the 59.0 from a statistical point of view.
Okay.
However, support after information either goes up, down, or remains the same. And
what we're saying with the statistically significant is that it may have gone up or it may have gone down, if you look at that plus 5.5%, or plus or minus?
Yeah.
Okay.
More likely gone up, but not significant.
Okay. Slide 17, please. So if you look at overall levels of support favor, let's look at the left-hand favor column between 2013 and 2010. Can I apply the margin of error to that as well?
Yes.
So would it be fair to say that support for a new high school has not increased in a statistically significant way since 2010?
Correct.
Fair? Okay. But you could also say the same for opposition.
With opposition, after information moved from 38% opposition in 2010 to 30 in 2013.
Yes.
So in that particular case, that was a real decrease from a statistical point of view.
Right, so opposed went, yeah, okay, so.
Did I say undecided? I meant opposed.
Opposed, yeah. So, okay, good. Slide 19. Thanks, Dallas. So again, just applying the rule there, we're saying that at the lowest level we measured in this survey, $200 per 100,000 in assessed value, that was the lowest amount we asked about. We would characterize that as either supportive or not supportive. It could be more than 50%, it could be, right?
47.5, if I'm doing my math right, to 58.8.
Yep, okay. Okay.
One other thing while you're thinking of your next question that I think relates to your question on this particular slide, I'd also remind you that with the sampling demography, we somewhat undersampled parents and oversampled older registered voters. If you go through the process of bringing that back and weighting statistically, you probably pick up 1.5 to 2% in a positive direction. So this
So am I to
should be
interpret all of the...
conservative.
So how should I take the rest of the survey then, now that you've said that? Should I add 1.5 to 2% to everything in here?
This is, I don't know that there's any great value in doing that, but the point I was making is analyzing the demography of the sample. This should be moderately conservative so that the true results should be this or slightly better. Slightly in this case, as I said, is, maybe a point or point and a half.
Okay, well, I mean, you say that about parents, I believe we were talking about there, right, which was slide 5, Dallas, where we undersampled parents and oversampled non-parents. If you go back to slide 3, though, it looks like we oversampled females in a statistically significant way, who you said are, on average, more supportive in general.
Yeah.
So in your opinion, do those compensate or cancel each other's out, or how should I compare those to each other?
Well, the differences demographically with older registered voters and the parent population on a percentage basis was greater than this example. And so on the weight of it, it would still be demographically equal to or slightly better than what you're seeing. The other thing to remember is these were collected in April, and just like national surveys, particularly in political races, the closer you get to the day people cast ballot, the more accurate the surveys are. And this would be true, of course, with your project as well. But in a reasonably good position today.
Okay. Let's go to 31, please, Dallas. Thank you. Am I supposed to apply the law or the margin of error here as well of plus or minus 5.5%? Okay. Why, I know that you said we concentrate on the A's and B's and the C's and D, or the D's and F's. What about the C's?
Well, it's not that we ignore anything. I was just making the point that over many, many years of doing this and asking similar questions all over the country, what we found is that if the ratio of A's and B's to D's and F's are in that very high positive framework that I talked about, it's a very, very good indicator that you're in pretty good shape. Obviously, over time, many districts will do a study like this every 4 or 5 years, whether they're doing a referendum or not, because they're interested in tracking how they do.
Yeah, let's
over
look
time.
at that. Next slide, Dallas. So if you compare our results in 2013 to our 2010 results, and you apply the margin of error, I'm just going to make sure I'm correct in how I interpret this. I'll ask you a couple questions. The number of people, or the percent of people giving us an A didn't change in a significant way.
Correct.
Okay. The percentage of people giving us a B went down in a statistically significant way.
Just outside the area of measurement.
What about the percentage of folks giving us a C?
Those were
Unchanged?
still within the area of measurement, yeah.
Okay.
The biggest shift here, of course, is that once you get past the A's, which are essentially identical from one year to the next, when you more than double the percentage of unable to evaluate, something else has to go down.
But the B's went down is what we're saying.
And C's.
B's and C's went down. Okay. When you look at us compared to the national, this is truly a national question, the Gallup question, so people that live in the Milwaukee Public School District answer the same question as the people that live in the Washington, D.C. Public School District, as the people that live here.
Correct.
Okay? Uh, 39, please, Dallas. So I would interpret this that about, if you look at that 52.7% agree or strongly agree that we can be trusted to manage their additional tax revenue. About half, fair statement?
Correct.
You're 5% too.
Slide 40, please. This is a comparison to 2010, correct?
Correct.
So the top line is 2010, bottom line on each of those is 2013?
Correct.
So just help me, what's happened to the, if you add the, do you do the same thing here? Do you add the A's and B's and the C's and D's to get a measure of success there?
We haven't tracked this particular question in the same way over time as the other one we talked about, because not all clients use this question, but all of them do use the Phi Delta Kappa question. So whether that would track the same way over time, I guess maybe it would, but I don't know.
Okay. So if you just add the agrees and the strongly agrees together, that aggregate has gone down. Disagree and strongly disagree have remained the same, and the agrees and the agrees have gone to don't knows. Is that how I should interpret that?
Yeah.
Slide 42, please. I have no questions there, more of a comment. I think that speaks more to what's happened with other things on this list. But I do want to give kudos to Carrie Fisher for the improved quality of our communications, and I think thus the improved impact of the district newsletter. Thank you for doing that. Can we go to slide 44, conclusions and recommendations? I think we sort of covered the first bullet with the other questions. Let's look at the bottom bullet for a moment. It says that community tax dollars has increased, support at the lowest tax rate tested decreased support from 59 to 53.3. So in other words, the lowest number, the lowest price point we tested for, if you will, in terms of tax impact, put us from a narrow win into either a narrow win or a narrow loss category.
Well, the 59% would forecast a win just based on that particular data point.
But at 200 per 100K, it
Then you
wouldn't
move to the
necessarily.
53.3,
Right.
which puts you on the bubble. And
So tell me more about how you got to $189 per 100,000 of equalized value.
Well, as I commented before, there were line graphs that were in the PowerPoint that...
Which, then that's line, you're talking about the line graph on slide 19?
I don't recall the slide number, but...
I think it is, Dallas, 19?
That's correct.
Mm-hmm.
And so...
So that represents what we've actually measured there, correct?
Correct.
Okay.
And so at 53.3, as you commented correctly, that represents a narrow win or a narrow loss statistically by the time you add the 5.5% plus and minus. And so there's a formula that our survey consultant uses that looks at where that line would project to cross at 50% plus 1, and then moves you back and provides some cushion just slightly outside of the error of measurement.
Moves us back and slightly, I presume there's some math behind those words and adjectives?
Correct.
Okay.
It's an attempt to look at the most pessimistic outcome at 200 and then move you back to where we would project that you could win outside of that error of measurement.
+1, plus a little smidge is what you sort of said there.
Yeah. When you see 189, it looks extremely scientific and precise. Why not 188 or 190?
It doesn't actually sound totally precise now that you've put it that way.
But it really is a guideline. We do studies like this with districts where, let's say, 189 is the number that's recommended, and they, ask for 219 and win. And we also sometimes have districts that we give them 189 and they go for 169 and they lose. Now, you might say, well, there's something wrong with the survey. Well, what you have to remember, as we talked before, is two really important things. One, there's a lot of things that happen between April when we collect the data and when people cast their ballot, and we don't even know when that's going to be yet. Recessions come and go, consumer confidence goes up and down, local things happen, plants close, plants open, so there's lots of moving parts. The second thing that we don't know is when the board finally decides what you're going to do and when, is it going to be an A-plus effort, an F effort, or somewhere in between? And that makes a huge difference. In other words, how well are you going to communicate? How well are you going to engage within the community? How hard are you going to work? So there's lots of variables. So that number, while statistically, it's derived statistically, it's a guideline. And I think the best advice I could give you would be, in the absence of major economic, political, local changes, the closer you stay to that number, the more likely you're going to be successful. The further north you stray, the less likely you're going to be successful.
No further questions.
Thank you, Dan. All right, thank you, Don.
Thank you very much, and if you have questions that come up later that you didn't think of, please give them to Roger, and we'll see that we get back to you. Good luck with your planning. Thank you.
Thank you.
Don, do you want to hang out a second? Maybe we'll let any questions from the group, we can cover those now.
Harold Clement, I have two. As far as the trust issue, 52.7%, Dan. If you subtract 5.5, you got less than half of the community to trust you. I'm not in favor of subtracting 5.5 off of everything. I look at the trend, and the trend is up, up, up. And then the other thing is, I do a lot of phone calling. When I phone call, generally, I get the woman of the house. Now, the question would be, if you're calling my house for this survey, are you going to ask for a male or a female?
Yes, the answer is we do ask for one or the other.
So you actually specifically say, is the man of the house there, or something to that degree?
Correct.
Thank you.
Good question. Thank you.
Anyone else? Jim?
Jim By Prescott. Thanks for the opportunity to ask questions. I was called on the survey. I was called twice. The second time a lady called and she went right through the questions and seemed very professional without any extraneous comments or anything. But the first time I was called by what sounded like a young man. And when he asked me, he made about 4 comments, personal comments, during the course of his questioning. The two I can remember most is when he asked would I support $200 for $100,000, Before he went on to the next question, he said, that's a lot of money on a $750,000 house. The second one I can remember is when he was going to ask a series of questions to gauge support, for example, Malone being overcrowded and an old science lab here and that. He mentioned these are the kind of questions school districts usually ask to get support. Very appropriate, in my opinion, for a survey. So my question is, what kind of, when I call my bank or I call my hospital caregiver or when I call even a construction person today, there's usually a recording or something. This call is being recorded to assure quality. And what kind of, I've assumed that the people that are hired to do the survey aren't just say, come on in, you're going to make $10 an hour, here's a list, call it in. What kind of training are they getting? What kind of oversight are they getting? And these particular questions I said are actually harmful to the district, but I only talked to 2 people. How many conducted the survey, and what assurances do we have that it wasn't also some similar things done that would be slanted and would project the survey the other way?
Thank you for that question. I'm always disappointed to hear a call that didn't go well, but to specifically answer your question, we only use a professional call center. All the people calling are trained, supervised. They work off prepared scripts that they're not supposed to deviate from. When we get a complaint about a particular call, and Roger, I'm sure you remember me telling you this, to tell me as soon as you hear it, and we can go back to the supervisor. We've taken people off calls when that's happened on other projects and brought in a different caller. While we'd like to have everything go perfectly 100% of the time, when you have multiple people calling simultaneously, you occasionally will have something that's less than top quality. And what we do to try to prevent that, again, is training, supervision, and then we also have a certain percentage for each caller where the person is called back at a later date and asked for their opinion and feedback about the quality of the person that made their call. And so, as I said, while I'd like to have everything go perfectly always, I think we do as much as we can to get a quality product out the door.
Thanks, Don. Anyone else?
Pat, I guess, Dan, I appreciate your question when you went with some of the statistical analysis. But I had a question of when Dan was asking about the $189. Now, let's say you're getting back to, I understand how you extrapolated basically of going back with that line.
Exactly.
Using the standard deviations and how the bell curve works with that type of thing. I'm going to say, let's say the school board says the school that we need is going to be a $207 per 100,000 assessed valuation. That, using the margin of errors, we stand in, 85% chance of that, way of looking at it a different way. We stand an 85% chance away of passing that referendum. You're always going to have a risk. That 189, in essence, was saying that's, from a statistical standpoint, you're going to win. But if we need more than that, we maybe have a 15% chance of losing. Would that be another way to characterize that?
Mm-hmm. You actually said it better than me. I think the way I said it was, the more you stray north of 189, the thinner the ice is going to get. But that doesn't mean that with the right proposal presented to the community in the right way, that, I don't know, did you use 209 as an example? Something somewhat more than that couldn't work.
Right.
You're absolutely correct.
Right. Someone else?
Kevin McCarthy. You indicated earlier that you had a section here, I'm trying to understand, that you said uninformed and informed, and after they received that information, I didn't see a copy of that information that we informed them. Do we have that, or is that public record?
Those were the questions on the slides that had the horizontal bars.
And so that was uninforming.
And those were questions that
Kevin,
were
it's in the back
asked.
of this if you want to take a look. The survey itself is right here, so you can see the questions themselves.
And then one last question, then. How much did this cost?
Well, I don't know off the top of my head. Do you, Roger?
You know, I don't have the exact dollar figure. Kevin, I can get it to you. It's about $15,000 for the survey.
For 300 people, about $50 a person, is that fair?
If you want to look at it that way, there's a lot to go to with developing the survey questions and more than just calling and so on, and interpreting the results and so. Yeah, that'd be one way to look at it.
Well, yeah, how many PhDs and people with master's degree do we have in our school district?
Okay, any other questions for Don?
No, we're fine.
Thanks, Kevin. Any other question? All right.
Again, thank you, and
Thank
get
you.
back to me
Thanks,
if there are
Tom.
more questions.
Appreciate it.
All right. We'll move to item number 2, is discuss possible PCR structure. And you realize this is something that we put Mike in charge of. Mike, did you want to go over this?
Sure. Basically, on the back page of the agenda, there's a draft reporting structure that I wanted to propose to the board here. And this kind of came out of some feedback that I took from after backfilling for Mr. Vorthrom's spots for the vice principal, the athletic director, and the PCR director. Once we got that all figured out, I took some feedback back and came up with a different structure. It's similar. There's a couple of differences here. Well, number one, I wanted to clarify the reporting structure a little bit more. If you go down to the PCR advisory board, I guess that's where it starts kind of getting a little bit different from the previous one that we had. And it basically just clarifies that the PCR board would act more as an advisory board to the PCR director, and the director would have actually the final say. And the reason I think this might be a better approach is because this is kind of how we structure our other programs that we have. We have the community ed, we have health and wellness, and I don't know if there's any others, but we basically have a paid position for those groups, for those programs, making the decisions, and then there's a volunteer advisory board on those committees that are basically providing feedback and helping guide those decisions. So this just kind of clarifies that, and it's more of a clear reporting structure. Before, I kind of felt that the PCR director almost was reporting to two different groups. You had the athletic director that they're reporting to, and possibly the board. And in reality, at the board meetings, it acted more as an advisory board, I would say. So this kind of fits that model a little bit. It clarifies that a little bit more here. And the other big change here that I'd like to propose is the introduction of these program committees. And really what the committees are is a smaller group of people that consist of the PCR director, possibly the program commissioners. And I put commissioners because if you use the example of baseball, you have your in-house program, and then you have your traveling program. Same could be applied for basketball. So you could potentially have two commissioners there, and I think it would be important to have both commissioners on that program, helping shape both sides of that for the in-house and for traveling, and clarifying the differences between the two. Also, the PCR, there'd be a PCR board representative on that committee, along with a new proposal here would be to have some role of the high school varsity coaches on each of these committees as well. I think that's important to have the coaches' input when making direction. PCR is different than high school sports. I want to make that clear because that kind of came up in our PCR board meeting. One of the questions was, having the high school varsity coach, could that potentially be a problem for the mission of PCR? Meaning, maybe the varsity coach wants to steer the direction in possibly a more competitive way down at the lower levels. And one of the missions of PCR is to make sure that we're providing opportunity for all. And so I think having the varsity coach on there is important, but I want to be clear that it's an advisory committee. The program committee is an advisory committee. They would have recommendations for program changes, and be responsible for the strategic direction of the program with the help of the PCR director as kind of the governing, looking out for what's best for PCR and for the kids. One of the notes I'd like to kind of just keep talking about the program committee approach is, I think it puts, from a PCR board perspective, I think you get the board members get to be a little bit more involved at a lower level and drive programs that they might be passionate about, or programs that they might want to learn more about that they want to be a part of. So I think it helps engage the PCR board a little bit more. I kind of felt from my interpretation over the last couple of years that we have had good participation from the board, but you can see that there are certain topics or certain programs that members of the board are more passionate on, that I think if we put them in committees and help drive those programs at that level, it would be more productive. So those are the two big items that I wanted to kind of touch base on that would probably cause a lot of discussion around that. So I'll just keep talking here. I wanted to make sure that this is clear too. One of the things that was on the last one that was also on this one is there's communication. The dotted lines really represent collaboration between the two boxes. So like if you use the PCR advisory board to the school board, we want to make sure that the school board rep or the PCR director or both are providing updates back to the school board, and that the school board representative on the PCR board is providing direction when needed from a school board perspective. So I think that collaboration, I just want to make sure that's called out. And then, you could really draw lines between each of the committees too, because I think that there's policies that can be set within one committee that you could collaborate and bring over to other programs and make sure that there are differences between the programs, but there's a lot of similarities too. And I think some of the things that the survey touched on were coaches selection and league selection was one of the things that was brought up for traveling. And just basically, so there's similarities between all the PCR programs, but there's also, which we should be able to collaborate across the different committees, and I think that's where the PCR board members can help with. But there's enough differences there. I think that if you have a smaller group that's helping drive the necessary improvements if needed, that they can focus on that.
Okay. We'll open up for questions. April?
Someone else go first.
All right, Dan.
So this is a proposal, by the way. I'm not.
This is
all it is a proposal. I came up with this, and I wanted to bring it by you guys to see, if there's any feedback or tweaks or what your thoughts are.
All right, Dan.
So I know how to interpret this. You have solid lines and dotted lines. What are those supposed to represent?
The solid lines really is the reporting structure of the org chart. So the PCR director is a direct report of the athletic director. And
Are you okay, so the PCR director reports directly to the athletic director?
Yes.
And you're proposing that for PCR-related purposes, the athletic director reports directly to the superintendent?
Yes.
Where's the high school principal in this?
The high school principal is not in this one.
So for PCR-related matters, the athletic director reports directly to the superintendent? Is that the case for all AD related matters, or does the AD report to the principal on other matters?
Dan, the answer to that is in other matters that AD reports to the high school principal first.
That could be done if that works better.
PCR also encompasses the elementary grades, which the athletic director does not encompass.
So the PCR director has responsibility for things that the athletic director position doesn't have current responsibility for at the high school.
Yeah, the high school athletic director, I believe, is responsible for the extracurricular activities, mostly 7 through 12, but they do have some 6th graders in cross-country, I believe. Because we don't have any school teams, I don't believe, below the 7th grade, except for 6th grade cross-country.
But the athletic director under this org chart would administer or manage the PCR director, so have de facto responsibility for those lower grade, this program.
That's correct.
Right, and report directly to you on that. Is that correct? Is that what I'm seeing from the solid lines here?
You know, yes, from a PCR perspective, I left the high school principal out of it because I felt that it kind of muddies the org chart from a PCR perspective.
Well, I guess my questions would be from a real life perspective, how that would all work operationally. When you have the AD reporting to the superintendent on some things and to the principal on others.
So how does it work today?
Well, Dan's got a point there.
Yep.
The athletic director is supervised and evaluated by the principal, the high school principal.
Okay.
So
maybe we should
it
put the high
wouldn't
school
bother.
principal
I'd be fine if there was another link in there with the high school principal between the superintendent and athletic director. That's the superintendent, whoever that is, doesn't supervise the athletic director. The principal does.
Okay. So we could put the high school principal in there just for clarity?
Good.
So if you put the high school principal in there, you'd put him between athletic director and superintendent on that vertical chain, correct? Right, athletic director up to high school principal, up to superintendent?
Yep.
Correct? So does that mean then that the high school principal is responsible for PCR at some level, would be responsible for some issues like that before they get to the superintendent?
How is it today?
I mean, how is it operating today?
Yeah, how would we classify that today? So if the PCR director, because to be honest, my focus was more on the PCR director on down and making sure that there's a clear chain. From the athletic director on down. The athletic director would be responsible for managing the PCR director, but when you get above the athletic director, I would look to Roger to see.
I think it's something we should look at, because in this particular case, you may want to, depending upon what students that are being managed and what building it's in, that you would have that person report to the building principal if they're dealing with the middle school and the elementary school. I think principals should have some say in there or some responsibility, and I think if we can figure that out and in a reasonable way that makes it manageable. Dan, do you have any suggestions on that?
I don't, unfortunately, I don't have suggestions for a solution yet. I just see a big problem there.
I guess I'd have to get more information from the current athletic director, high school principal aren't here yet tonight to give you a better answer on that,
Is
Mike.
principal high school, is V here?
No, neither one is here.
He did comment on that in our last PCR meeting. Remember, Mike, that the high school, his view was that the high school principal was not part of this chain of command.
Yeah, you're right.
We're trying to figure this out. I think it's
Doesn't
a
make
good
sense.
topic of discussion, and that we should build that line of communication and get that very clear so we have the clear reporting, because this is why we have the questions on PCR. So I'm glad we're addressing it. We're not going to get an answer tonight, but this information and discussion is meant to bring up these questions so we can solve them. So I think that's a very valid question, and I think we should turn it to the athletic director, the principals, the superintendent to come with some clear direction back to us on how they would perceive the management of it, because that's what that's asking, right, Dan?
Yep. Okay, so let's set aside the fact that it's murky when you get to the actual leadership part there. We don't have the leadership actually figured out there. If you look then, athletic director, the PCR director reports to the athletic director. And under this proposal, the advisory board, a dotted line reports up to the PCR director, advises, feedback, and support.
Yeah, it's not a report, it's more of a collaborative engagement. They're an advisory board.
Okay, and at the same time, it looks like the PCR advisory board is feeding back directly to the school board.
Yes, through the school board representative.
And then it looks like the program committees need to communicate through the PCR advisory board for their communication to get to the PCR director. Is that the flow of communication you envision there? Am I supposed to follow the dotted lines?
Since the PCR director is going to be on each of those committees, the way this flows is that, yes, that the program committees would come up with recommendations. The advisory board would hear those recommendations and maybe make some feedback, and ultimately the recommendation is either adhered to or changed by the PCR director, is how I'd see that. But since the PCR director is on those committees, I'm hoping that can be solved at a lower level.
So the PCR director is on a program committee which makes a proposal to the PCR advisory board that agrees or disagrees with that or advises on that, but then it goes to the PCR director who was actually on the program committee to start with.
It's a collaboration.
Okay, so what is the value of the PCR advisory board in that loop?
And that's, you know what, that's a good question, Dan, because that was brought up at the PCR meeting, is whether or not should we even have an advisory board.
Why would you?
Right.
Given the redundancy in this structure.
And that certainly is something that we could talk about, I think.
Well then, so where's the check and balance in a community, right? The C in PCR is community. Where's the check and balance on the PCR director when your program committee consists of PCR director, program commissioner, and high school varsity coach, and reports up to the AD who's based in the high school? I'm not sure I understand how this actively represents the interests of our lower grades. It seems sort of stacked toward a high school sports perspective, and it looks like the advisory board, I mean, their value is questioned. I guess I question the value, and educate me if you can. I mean, what's the value of having a PCR advisory board here?
I thought that the value might be that as program committees make changes, that it would be good for the advisory board to hear those changes. But again, it's a proposal, so I'm not saying it's perfect. We've talked about whether or not there's value in having an advisory board.
Well, Dan, do you see that as a spot to have more community involvement? As a checks and balances?
Well, weren't we talking in a previous meeting about how the PCR advisory board had an opportunity to step up and not step, and this is stepping back, right? You've put more things around, and you've created almost a climate of zero impact for the advisory board when your PCR director does this, boom, and is up here to approve things. So I thought we talked last time about...
I guess, Dan, my question to you, I mean, we're trying to solve it now.
Well, my question mark was, hadn't we talked earlier about having this actually be a governing board and making it more of the C in PCR versus more of the PSD in PCR? What happened to that line of thinking? I thought we were sort of agreeing with that last time.
There was a couple meetings, I think, since then that you weren't at. We talked about this topic, didn't we?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's why.
Looking at the line of structure on having a direct supervisor to the PCR director. And the school board would be part of that community. But if you want to solve some of that problem, I don't think it's a deal killer to not have the PCR director on those program committees. Do you put more impact from the community at that level, which is right where, you define step in and step back, or step forward and step back. I look at this as more involvement from the people that want to be involved rather than less. When you put a governing board above the PCR director, who also answers to the athletic director, who then answers to whatever we decide, that's a lot of bosses in a lot of different directions, and actually kind of proving right now that it's not working, in my eyes. Where this
current system's not working for sure.
And that's kind of what we have now. So that's why this intrigues me, where if we maybe take the PCR director off of some of the lower ones and get some more community involvement in the advisory board. So when these things come back up to the advisory board, they say, this is what this committee thought. How does this impact everybody? Everybody weighs in and it moves forward. If we could.
So Mark, you said, I think you made a very valid point in that the current structure, or the way we're operating it is not working. Remind me again how this structure is different than the current structure. Remind me of the differences then.
Well, right now, the way I see this is that there's some very clear direction for the PCR director to answer to. And right now, I don't see that.
But the reporting structure is the same as it was. If you look at PCR director on up, isn't it?
Dan, I think the whole process on this was, let's get this thing clear, because it isn't.
I don't think PCR is broken. I think it needs clarification.
I'm just going off what Mark said, and I'm asking, it looks like the major difference here is that we've added program committees.
I think if you want to pick apart whatever, go ahead, but what I'm
just
trying
asking, I'm trying to find the difference, man. I'm asking, because the rest of it looks similar to me.
I think that we're defining this. I don't think that was very clear before. I really don't. And I don't think that the board that was in place was working very well at this point. That's why we're talking about it now, because there was a lot of.
Well, under this line of command, though, the fact that there was not clarity there, or it wasn't working optimally, is first on the athletic director at the time, and secondly on the superintendent at the time. So I don't know what the board's culpability in that. Ultimately, absolutely. I'm glad we're solving it. My concerns are that you've rendered the PCR advisory board useless by adding program committees.
I completely disagree. Completely disagree.
Go ahead.
Because now they're getting more involved in more focused on particular programs in PCR versus trying to govern all the
program
programs.
Committees? Is that why?
Yes.
Because they make it happen.
They help make it happen.
Our committees that we have as a board, or we less, because we have committees?
You have more focused committees. It's no different than when we set board goals and we break down into different groups and solve a problem, or we have a task to perform, and we have a goal, and we break down into different communities. This is the same thing. We're going to break down into smaller groups and drive change if needed. And the PCR board members, that's where they're going to be.
By the PCR director and the athletic director.
The PCR director is on there because the PCR director should be involved in all of those.
Okay. So the PCR
whether or not
director,
the PCR director gets involved at that level, if we want to take out the PCR director below that, I'm up for that. That's fine. I put him in there, or her in there, because I think it's important that we're making sure that these groups are adhering to PCR mission, and the PCR director is paid to make sure they're following that mission. And so that is kind of why it's like the watchdog on the program committees. I'm still thinking that the program committees, there's in a positive collaborative environment, they can make positive changes, and the PCR director can be a part of that.
Going through the 5th and 6th grade baseball thing, part of the questions came up with coaching is always came up with was training. And I think I think our direction from our high school or varsity coaches that are involved on these committees should be focused in on knowledge to help coach rather than knowledge to make sure it's competitive or not competitive, because
Exactly.
that's
exactly the
question
point.
that came up a lot when we were talking about the Raider Nation issue we're working up. They wanted that, and they wanted the feedback from the coach to help them teach other coaches and get clinics and become involved in a very positive manner rather than not make it just, well, you're going to be my feeder program. No, we need to help teach people how to coach, and this is how you do X, Y, and Z.
The key reason that the high school varsity coach is on this is to be more involved and to help PCR.
So that's cool, and I love the connection, right, with the high school varsity coaches and all that. But I mean, look at that program committee, PCR director, right, somebody who's already paid, program commissioner, somebody who's already on board and theoretically to this point has been running a program. Some of them would say just fine, thank you. PCR board representative, right, somebody who's already engaged. And that we're saying this program committee is like a subcommittee, into the tactical application, hands down. High school varsity coach, somebody who's already on the payroll and invested. Those are all good things.
Add more. What do you think would help?
More community members.
Let's add some there. And that's why we're doing
More
this.
community members, right? This is a different way of you're pushing peas around the plate here and rearranging our current people in different ways. But I still don't think you've solved for a PCR advisory board that can have a lot of impact, because it's just, I mean, a watchdog on a chain can only bark, to use your metaphor. And I would think we need to add some more community. Yeah. So those program committees, I would imagine, I'd want some parents.
I think that's a good suggestion too.
I'm not against it. The reason we talked about this, and the reason I chose to propose it this way is to keep those committees at a small enough group where they can actually make change. I think if you get 10 people in a room, things don't get done. So if we're going to add community members, I'm fine with that, but I think my recommendation would be 1, maybe 2 tops on each program committee.
That makes sense.
Otherwise you get too many cooks in the kitchen and we spin our wheels.
Sometimes you find those committees whittle themselves down to the ones that will actually get it done anyway.
Yeah.
You start with opportunity. Actually, what I think Dan was saying is you prefer community opportunity to be involved.
The PCR board representative is a volunteer person. That is a member of the community. So in essence, that is a community member.
Right, who is in a, I think we talked about this one of the last times. One of the reasons people volunteer is so that they can have an impact and that they can make a difference.
And that's
right, and that's why I think that this is going to work.
Well,
because they are going to make a difference.
I think we backed off of that when we said it is not a governing body, and we put the same old reporting structure up the line in there. Let me understand this though, because if I'm the only guy, that's fine. Describe for me. You say I missed a couple meetings, etc. Since we talked last, which was a couple months ago now, what was your process? Who did you involve? Who did you talk to? What's the process you went through to get to this?
Dan, I came up with this. All right. I'm not going to go into it right now. If you want to take it offline, I will. I'm not going to talk about it right now.
Hold on a second, man.
No.
What do you mean? I mean, I'm asking you how this came to be. Are you saying you made it up yourself, or?
Dan, I came up with this, all right?
Okay. And ran it by,
took some feedback.
Tell me about what you did to run it by people.
Took some feedback from people. I took some feedback from Roger. Took some feedback from Mark.
Okay, like the PCR board, how many of them did you talk to?
I talked to several members of the PCR board.
Like all of them?
Can we stop? I mean,
I'm asking how we got here.
Dan, you're turning this to an inquisition on somebody you put in charge of coming up with a proposal.
This is a good proposal.
I'm asking these questions in the hopes that we can do a good job of validating it with people that we may have missed on the front end.
I was put in charge to do this, and this is what I came up with. If you don't like it, we can talk about it. Make changes.
I'm trying to.
Okay, so Dan, what do you already said?
I'm asking questions. Are you saying that you're done answering them?
I've answered them, Dan.
I don't
So
think this is...
let me ask a more
I don't-
positive, forward-thinking question then. In your
That'd be
opinion,
pleasant.
who should we talk to going forward to validate this structure and make sure it works for our stakeholders and key constituents?
We're right here.
Anyone
this
else?
is it, right?
Anyone else?
Well, what do you think as a board? This is
Didn't
brought...
we do a survey? Didn't you take some of that into consideration, the community survey?
Yeah, where are the results of the PCR? We should be looking at those as we validate whether this structure is good going. That'd be a great data point. Maybe we could take a look at those survey results as a sort of an objective way, right, and a less biased way of evaluating. Do we have those results available?
We have
Carrie has some information.
an analysis that was done. I wasn't part of the analysis. Carrie helped with that.
Have you
so
seen the analysis?
I have.
All right, I haven't.
So we have, is there any other information you want to talk about this? Obviously, this is a good starting point. We have a discussion.
Yep.
I really prefer not to put the person in charge who put a lot of time into an inquisition type, like, where in the heck did you come up with this? And rather, why don't we work from this and build forward?
To be clear, my questions were about the process that has been followed to get us to this point, part of information and discussion.
So, any answer to your question? Any other questions about this point?
I have no further questions.
All right. We will move now to recognition of visitors. Would anyone care to be recognized at this time?
Lisa Gencover, I live in Clifton Township. I've been on the PCR board for 3 years. My term has been just expired. As a member of the board, I have seen, even as we have been an advisory group, as Dan had mentioned, I appreciate your questions, Dan. Mike has known, I've been quite frustrated. I feel that Ruth has been in a tough position. I feel that the community hasn't had the opportunity to stand up for what they think is right to support the mission. I have been part of a meeting where we voted on things that didn't support the mission and tried to get rid of programs. I hope that you guys will strongly spend some time in asking the community and make sure that they're involved in decision-making. I think having school employee, salaried people running things is just not, there's no check and balance. I mean, that's why we have checks and balances, especially if it's going to be a community rec program. If it's not going to be a community rec program, then I'm fine with that. I mean, that's been part of our discussion for quite some time. Then don't make it a community rec program. Make it a sports or association. But that, I think I was part, Mike did invite me to be part of the reorging. We talked about the board being a governing board. This is new. Mike did not talk to me about this up front beforehand. I have not, you sent me an email before our board meeting. I was shocked. I was really thinking we were going the right direction. Being part of that, I did see the survey and the survey results. I was amazed that we had 44 questions. I just think, as we are all so busy, for people to fill out, 44 questions. Well, on the 44th question, we had 68 responses. They took the time, 68 people, out of those people that took the survey, and Carrie can tell us how many took the survey, 68 people took the time to tell us their comments after completing 44 questions. Don't you think you'd be tired after doing a survey that long? But they took the time to give us comments, and some of these comments are like a page long. So I ask us to definitely look at this data as we look at our structure for PCR. Thank you.
Pat Ike, Mike, I want to thank you for working on this. And one of the things of looking here that I think the board is struggling with is when you were talking about the structure of going from athletic director and principals and that type of thing, the one thing is you're using of kids of being kindergarten through fifth grade. And part of it is maybe looking at simplifying the structure a little bit, is that
its school board, the PCR advisory board in a linear matter to then the PCR director. I liked how you have the program committees putting that in, is getting that committee involvement. But part of it is when you then have direct community involvement is then supervising the PCR director, and you're not having to deal with the vertical problems of dealing with the athletic director, whether it's a elementary school, a middle school, that type of thing. You've eliminated a problem. You've eliminated steps of supervision. And I guess it's simplifying the process down. And that would be my suggestion is that when you simplify it down, you maybe make it a little bit cleaner, and you broaden what the public is doing at the bottom end to be bringing things in. So thank you for your work on that.
Mic is open. One more shot. Thank you. We're adjourned.